Hey there, APHUG team. I am ready to go with our first flipped video lecture for urban and city land use. So just a reminder, we're going to go over a few introductory key terms and ideas relating to urban. Please make sure you have your geolog book handy, and away we go. Okay, first things first, on our screen we have the word that is urban with a question mark next to it. Now in class we did a class brainstorm in which I had you guys write cities or urban in the center, and we brainstormed different qualities or characteristics that we associated with urban centers. So what is an urban area in the simplest sense? There's many definitions that exist, and they come in many different types and structures and sizes. Their common characteristics, the fact that we call them they're nucleated, they have a center, basically with one or more clear core areas, and that people who live and work in them are usually working in non-agricultural jobs. So in contrast, of course, we're talking about rural, which is agricultural. We're talking about urban, we have that more mentality of more of those cities. Words like cities and towns describe these nucleated settlements that perform multiple residential and non-residential functions. Towns, of course, are smaller and less complex, but the term urban is kind of relative. So for example, in Portugal, to be classified as a city or urban, we're talking a population density of 10,000. If we're talking Ethiopia, more like 2,000. And in Norway, I think it's classified about 200 people. So urbanism, it kind of depends on our experiences, but there's definitely similarities, and kind of the big one we can go to as geographers is population size, or even more specifically, population density. All right, so some notes to jot down. So we just talked about the urban areas characteristics-wise. We know that they're usually large in size, high density as far as population. Interesting enough, today we live in a world where 51% of the population is now considered classified urban, and it's definitely on the rise. So this again is one of our, not that of course they're all relevant and important, but one of our more relevant units of study looking at urban and cities. Now, of course, with that high density, there's a competition for space, and that's going to definitely influence our discussion, of course, looking at, we dive into central place theory and looking at the bid-rent theory, and basically, again, we're talking about land use, we're talking about rent, we're talking about housing. That's obviously going to make a huge impact. And then I believe also in class we mentioned the fact that in cities and urban areas, we also classify them as more diverse. There's more diversity, there's more different types of people, more cultures interacting. Because we can definitely say that besides the fact that cities have, diversity as far as the services provided, economic diversity, we should say, but cultural diversity, cities, of course, they pull in lots of people. Number one, we talked about the draw of cities where migrants are going to flock to cities. Number one, because there's greater opportunity for jobs. And of course, there's more like-minded people. There's more immigrants in the cities, more opportunity, more types of housing, types of cultural landscape qualities or characteristics. So we can also classify as one of our characteristics. Now, of course, if we're talking about urban, we're going to introduce the concept of a city. So a simple definition to take a look at. City, we're talking buildings that are clustered together as part of center of politics and culture and economics. But we can kind of we'll look through the chapter different ways to break down cities. So in some cases we have what's called a central city, which usually kind of think about in your mental movie as the main city, the physical city that kind of has the central part, and then nearby towns and suburbs. Then we also could use as geographers the term urbanized area, which is referring to a portion which is built up, buildings, high population density, providing more apartments or things like different types of services like we read about in chapter 12. And then we can also classify cities or use the term in some of your vocab terms, the term metropolitan area, whereas basically urbanized areas that are integrated into one. So these can be part of larger metropolitan areas, a large-scale functional entity, more academically. It kind of operates as an economic whole. So for example, the U.S. Bureau of Statistics currently defines a metropolitan statistical area as the central county or counties within at least one urbanized area of at least 50,000 people. Plus, it also counts like the adjacent or the attached counties with a large number of residents that actually commute in. Now, another one of our terms we'll look at for the vocab matchup is the micropolitan statistical area, which is similar but a smaller version of the metropolis, which is one urban cluster between roughly about 10,000 to 50,000 people, plus the outlying counties with considerable, of course, social and economic integration. All right, so I believe we talked about these in class, but these might be good to also jot off to the side, or maybe even create a little cluster bubble to remind us again, cities are centers of. So some terms or some connections to make, of course, cities we're going to look at through the lens of they're centers of political power. Usually, again, all cities, historically at least, administrative centers. Think about historically where we have kings or religious figures or centers of power are concentrated in the cities. Cities become the center of industry and trade and commerce. Higher education, usually we think about universities, major cities around the world having the most prestigious and well-informed and academically engaged education. Technological innovation, markets and services, centers of specialization. We'll look at different cities necessarily identify as, specialized in certain services or different economic activities. And then, of course, in Chapter 12, the supplier of services. Now, just after defining, of course, what is urbanism and cities, we also have to introduce the concept of something known as urban hierarchy. So hierarchy, we're talking about clustered settlements range in size from hamlets all the way to megalopolises, and then they're arranged in hierarchy according to the complexity of their centralizing functions, or actually what they're doing. So the hamlet, we're talking about hamlet is usually a small cluster of farmers, of houses, and perhaps a few basic services, kind of think about such as a gas station or maybe like a general store, maybe kind of a mom and pop coffee shop. Our next in the hierarchy, kind of moving up the scale, which would be the village. The village would be the next smallest urban settlement. It's likely to offer several dozen services that are more specialized than those of a hamlet. Stores sell only certain goods as opposed to just like the general stores. And the gas stations may actually be selling or maybe competing. There's a competition for gasoline, another example. Town would be next on the list. Now the town is not only larger than the village, its structures have more specialized functions. It might have something like a bank, a post office, maybe a hospital, schools, library. A town is also, we could look at it through the lens of a hinterland, or it's a surrounding area of smaller villages and hamlets that are economically dependent on it. People that live in the hinterland depend on the town for these services, and they also might commute or actually work in the town. Then, of course, in our urban discussion, we're looking at the city. So the city, of course, we're going back to it has a higher population, population density, I should say, more functional specialization, larger hinterlands, greater centrality to the town. Whereas the towns have clustering of businesses as well as kind of like the outskirts along the outside. Cities have a well-defined central business district, or the CBD, as well as suburbs that might also have their own commercial centers or even shopping malls. And then finally at the tippy top we have the megalopolis, easy for me to say, and this is where multiple cities have grown together to form kind of like the highest level of urban hierarchy, the megalopolis. So for example, the megalopolis spreads on the east coast of the United States from Boston to beyond Washington, D.C. They even call it like the nickname, I think they call it Bosnia-Wash? I don't know. I might have to check that nickname. But this is something you will be needed familiar with. We are going to talk about how this relates the urban hierarchy to central place theory, and if we look at the hinterland and so forth. But, think of a little acronym that might remind you in terms of the urban hierarchy. So I think last year we used the phrase, hungry villains took chocolate muffins. I don't know. That's just one that came on top of my head. But again, think of an acronym that works for you. I know in math you use the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So you guys are flooded with acronyms, you're flooded with this, so this might be a good one to kind of commit to memory. Hungry villains took chocolate muffins. There you go. You're welcome. All right. If we're talking about urban environments or looking at the urban hierarchy, we also need to connect back to our discussion as geographers of site situation factors. So remember, another trick to remember: site, situation, think about the conditions versus the connections. So for example, the site, we're talking about absolute location, and usually cities historically, again, have been chosen for particular locations, advantages for trade or possible defense. So for example, Singapore, great, very developed city, and again, one of the reasons it had a great site in terms of it's an island. So it's perfect for trade, commerce, and of course, defense. Site factors, I was trying to think of another example, can be good and bad. So for example, Mexico City, site factors originally chosen, it was one of the Aztec major cities, but it was chosen because it was flanked by mountains. Now, originally that was sought as a good site factor, but we know that today in Mexico City, for example, those mountains actually prove to be more harmful because it actually traps in the sound and it really traps in a lot of the air pollution. So site factors is not easily changed. Now that's different, of course, if we're talking about why cities are chosen for their situation factors. So relative location would be another way to kind of connect back to Unit 1 for situation. So cities, their locations are chosen for the larger context. So think about it in terms of situation. Cities, they want to be close to transportation routes or close to farmland, close to manufacturing places. We're going to look at the example Rome in just a minute. So situation factors can change over time depending on the evolution. One day you're close to manufacturing. I know in our documentary Urbanized we looked at Detroit, which again had great situation in terms of location to steel. And then again, as the industry declined, you could definitely say it's the situation factors are somewhat shifting, so to speak. All right, so here's another one to take a look at: site situation. So the fact of the matter is Paris, which originally was established around a river. So site factors, it was good for trading, it was good for fishing, it was good for transportation, it was also good for defense. But of course, situation factors, France's focus on roads. Again, the situation factors today, we have international airports, we have the European rail network. So the fact that it's connected also, again, would improve its connectivity and its situation factors. And then close to home, I know this isn't the best map to take a look at, but this is actually a map kind of looking at Chicago. So Chicago also has, chosen or great site or situation factors because Chicago is kind of in that middle in terms of, on one side, it definitely has access to kind of the rich farmland and kind of the plains and agriculture. And then I mentioned before, again, over here, that it's really the hub of Detroit and the steel industry. So Chicago's at that kind of crux where it kind of is that middle ground between those two worlds colliding. You could also say Chicago has a really good situation factor today because, for lack of a better way of thinking, Chicago is kind of the center of the country. So for example, Chicago International Airport is one of the major airports in terms of, transcontinental air travel or international travel. So Chicago also has that situation factor. All right, also when we're talking about urbanization, of course, we have to go back historically, naturally, I'm still a history teacher, to the hearts of urbanization. So we looked through the lens, of course, even when we looked at agriculture. And before people could actually live in cities, they had to switch from hunting and gathering societies, again, to agricultural. So the first really agricultural revolution. So some cities grew out of these early agricultural villages, and kind of spread out from there. All right, so here's a map just kind of spatially think about in terms of the different hearts of urbanization. So over 7,000 years ago, people started sort of living in cities, and again, it connects back to our discussion for agricultural revolution. In world history, of course, you can see the map spatially that these hearths are located around river valleys. So you think about the Mesoamerican societies, you think about the Nile River Valley, the Egyptians,